Let's take a look at how you can implement custom arrows for your summary block carousels in Squarespace. This is only going to require a little bit of CSS and some image files for your left and right side arrows, so once you have those uploaded to your custom files, you'll be good to go. I'll be working with a summary block that has some additional styling applied to it, as you can see down here, but this is not necessary at all for this customization, so feel free to use the options and design that works best for your project. Since we're not adding something but replacing it instead, the first thing we need to look at is how the arrows are originally set up. This is the best way to decide how to approach the modification. It's going to allow us to see if we can simply make a value swap or add something new to an existing element. So going here through the Inspect Element tool and searching for the existing arrows, we can see that there are two elements. One with the class of Summary Carousel Pager Prev, another class of Previous, and a class of SQS Disabled, and a second element with a Summary Carousel Pager Next and another class of Next. Based on what's being highlighted on the screen when I stand over these elements, as you can see here in the corner, and considering the keywords that are involved in the classes, we can safely assume these are at least part of the arrow elements. Now, taking a closer look, we can see that there's something inside them because of this little arrow that we have on the side. If we open those up, we can see that they carry a pseudo element, a before pseudo element to be exact. And if we inspect the pseudo element itself, we can see here on the right side how the arrows are actually being created. Squarespace is using Unicode characters to set the left side chevron and the right side chevron. If what you want to do is to simply use a different Unicode character, then it's just a matter of targeting these pseudo elements, replacing their content property value, and you're good to go. But since what we're covering in this tutorial is how to substitute these arrows for images, we have to take a different approach. One way to replace these icons is to set the content property to empty by simply removing the content here and leaving only the quotes, and then setting our image file as a background image. Another way is to hide the whole pseudo element and use the background image on the container that's holding the chevron arrow or acting as its anchor. I've used this second route before, so that's the one that I'm going to be showing you, but feel free to try the other method if it feels faster or easier. Alright, let's set up our selector. I'm going to start by setting up the background image on the span element, the arrow container. And since there's no existing background image property to modify here, that means I have full freedom to set up my selector however I want. Mainly because I have no original code to compete with to be able to apply the new value. I'll begin by grabbing one of these classes and adding it to the custom CSS window. So let's go ahead and work here with Summary Carousel Pager Prev. Let's grab that and add it in here. Then I'm going to add in my background file. So let's set up background image URL. And then here, I'm going to select the left arrow. I'm going to include a few other background properties here just to make sure that the image doesn't repeat. So background repeat, no repeat. That the image is centered within the container. So background position center. And that it fits the whole size of the container. So background size, contain. Right now, it's pretty difficult to tell, but the arrow is actually showing up in there. In fact, if I zoom in a little bit, here you can see that we have my background image showing up behind the chevron. Next, I'm going to hide the original arrow. I'm going to be using display none for that, and I need to look at how I'm going to target that arrow. Looking at the original CSS of the pseudo element, I can see here on the right side that there is already the display property set up with a different value. That means that since I want to replace this value, doing so with something that's simpler than the existing selector that Squarespace is using may be a little bit more difficult. So let me show you what that means or what that looks like. If I take the same route as before and I target the pseudo element just by picking classes in here inside the Inspect Element tool, so that would translate into this. If I add display none here, nothing is going to happen on the screen. And then if I take a look at the Inspect Element tool, I can see that if I stand over that same pseudo element here on the right side, I'm gonna be able to see the snippet that I just created inside the custom CSS window being completely crossed off. This is happening because how Squarespace is addressing the original value is more specific. It's clear instructions about which element should carry that display of inline block. While right now I'm telling the browser to target any pseudo element attached to the previous arrow container and hide it, Squarespace here is saying target any pseudo element attached to the previous arrow container that's located within the SQS Gallery Controls container, which in turn is located inside the SQS Gallery Design Carousel container. And once you find that, set that display to inline block or set that element to inline block. This much more specific or stricter set of instructions is overriding our less specific ones. So the cleanest way to sort this out is to basically reuse what Squarespace is already using to set that first original value to tell our browser what the new value for that property should be. So now if I add that selector in here, you're going to see how the browser actually listens and it hides that arrow. All right, now that we're on the same page with the browser and it fully understands what we're trying to do, let's do the same thing for the next arrow. We're going to take the exact same approach here. We're going to target the container holding the chevron icon. We're going to give it the background image that we want, and we're going to set its background position, repeat, and size the same way as we did here. Then we're going to target the existing icon and we're going to hide it. So let's go ahead and get started by finding the class that we need for that arrow container. So here we can see that the class is very similar to the one we used before. It says Summary Carousel Pager Next, so that is what I'm going to be using in my code. I'm going to grab it here and add it down here. I'm pretty much going to copy the same declarations that I used before, add them inside this other snippet, and then I'm simply going to replace the URL with the other icon file. Next, I'm going to check how I'm going to hide the existing icon, but I have a pretty good idea of what that's going to look like in terms of selector based on what we used previously. Nonetheless, let's go ahead and take a look here, just to be sure that we're targeting what we need to. And in here, we can see that this is the selector that Squarespace is using to currently set the display to inline block. So to be able to change it pretty much without friction, we're just going to add that same selector and we're going to set here display none. You probably already noticed, but our barely visible custom arrows are now completely gone. That is because the original pseudo element chevron arrows were the ones setting the dimension for our span arrow containers. Now, luckily, this can be easily fixed by manually giving those containers a height and a width of our choice. So going back to the corresponding snippet, starting here with the previous one, we can set those values up. I'm going to be using a height of 50 pixels and a width of 50 pixels on both the previous arrow and the next arrow down here. All right, so at least we can now see the images, but there's something still a little bit off about the sizing because I do not believe that this is 50 pixels wide. If we go into the span container to take a look at what is going on, looking for our selector and our snippet, here we can see that the height and the width are actually applying. There's nothing being crossed off. So what is going on? Well, if we take it one step further or up in the structure, we can see that these two arrow containers are sitting within this parent container that here on the right side has a fixed width of 50 pixels. So evidently, my 50 pixel arrows are not fitting within that 50 pixel limit. So once more, since what we're trying to do is override the existing value because I don't want to have this limit anymore, I'm going to reuse the same selector that Squarespace is currently using to set those 50 pixels, since now we know that this is the easiest route to be able to replace a value. So let's go ahead and set here the width of auto so that the arrows can expand as much as they want to. And there you go. Now we have our custom arrows. I hope you found this tutorial helpful. If you have any comments or questions, go ahead and leave them down below. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.